are the universe, so beautiful. Through all of the hurt, we'll stand invincible, so beautiful. We'll take on the world. We'll take on the world.
What's up, hysterical people? Today is going to be a lot of fun. We have Eileen Tull with us, and we're going to talk about abortion in film. There's a lot of good movies out there that have depicted abortion in some fashion, for better or for worse. And Eileen and I have decided that we wanted to kind of dig in and see how abortion in film has evolved over the years and how that has impacted, those of us who may be watching the films. So I'm really excited to welcome Eileen Tull to the podcast today. Eileen is an amazing creative out of the Windy City of Chicago, and she works in the theater area. And she's a teacher, she's a director, she's a producer, and she's working on a couple of other film projects, which we're excited about as well. So, welcome to the podcast, Eileen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Yeah, so primarily a lot of my work is in theater, but I do a lot of film watching as well. My dream as a kid was to be kind of Robert Osborne film historian. So, that's kind of where I come to film right now as.
Well, hey, I'm an avid viewer as well. So I love to dig in with you. You and I are both passionate about bringing compelling stories to the audiences that need to hear them, maybe change their mind or open their mind a little bit, or certainly folks that maybe weren't exposed to certain topics. I know I've learned a lot from different films across over my lifetime, and I think abortion is something that nobody really talks about. And it's important to have exposure to these kinds of issues and situations that people find themselves in, regardless of what state you live in, what country, what your demographics are, what age you are, what gender, all of that. I think it's important for people to see the kinds of struggles that other people have to go through, and it will help them to understand and appreciate the topic and, of course, the cause. And people may never imagine that they would find themselves in a situation where they would need to make a difficult decision like getting an abortion. And I do think that a lot of times film can dramatize that in a way that's entertaining for audiences, but still gets the message across. So I think that's important.
Yeah, and I feel like we've seen that over and over again with social issues that back in the 60s, it was films like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. It's unfortunate that it would take a film to make people realize, like, oh, maybe Black people are people. Or their film like Philadelphia. Oh, maybe gay people are people. If you feel like it's not happening in your backyard, it's not real or it's scary or it's bad or morally wrong. And all the arts, in my opinion, are an empathy machine. And I feel like when you can see somebody's story, that can engender some empathy.
Yeah, I love that. An empathy machine. That's great. I think one thing that's going to be really interesting about our conversation is that you and I are both women living in the United States, but I think we're slightly or maybe a lot different in ages. And so I feel like I'm interested to hear your perspective versus mine about different films that landed at different eras. I found it really interesting how the topic has evolved over the years from the perspective of different options that have been available and have come available over the years, like the Plan B pill, the morning after pill, and the abortion medication. That didn't exist back in the day when I had my abortion when I was in high school. And so, since I'm older than you, I find it interesting and intriguing how our perspective on the topic and the different films that have happened over the years. I love movies because they help me escape from my real life, but sometimes you have that glimpse into somebody who has a more challenging life than you, helps you appreciate your own life, or somebody who's striving ambitiously and it helps inspire you. So there's lots of different ways we can take messages and good information from film. And one of those is abortion. So the first one for me that I didn't even realize until I went back to rewatch it was Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which I probably watched when I was 13 or so, which was before I unfortunately found myself in a situation where I needed to get an abortion. And since abortion was never talked about back then, I'm pretty sure that the only way that I actually found out that it was an option was from that movie. I mean, maybe now it's the kind of thing that is still not talked about enough, that there are probably a lot of people out there who maybe are only finding out about the different options that maybe exist for them because of films like Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which was a comedy. I mean, the biggest thing I remember about it was Spicoli being the like doofus dude. Of course, Sean Penn, we love him. I identified with it a lot because it was this group of people in high school that were older than I was at the time that I watched the film. Everybody probably has their own film that really spoke to them at a certain time in their life. That one for me was how I learned that abortion was an option. And thank God that I learned that and I was able to seek that out and get help.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say, so I'm like solid millennial. So I learned about this movie from the I Love the 80s series on VH1 that was very big when I was in high school. And I was always a big fan of classic film, so I knew of the movie, and I'd never seen it because growing up in a very conservative environment, this was a movie that was like just deemed inappropriate. Like I don't ever remember being told I can't watch it, but it was this movie's different. There's some sinfulness attached to it. And so I was like, oh well, I can't watch that one. I could watch Ghostbusters, which for some reason was totally appropriate. But anything with like teen sex and the unspoken abortion, it was like, well, that movie's really dirty. And watching the I Love the 80s, they talked about it. They sort of like go through the whole plot of these movies. And then I watched the movie shortly after. I probably would have been in high school when I did watch it. And it's so interesting because it, like you said, it's a comedy, it's a teen movie. Famously, Cameron Crowe like went undercover as a teen in a high school. So it had this pallor of like, this is real life, you know yeah, I was surprised finally watching it that it wasn't as terrifying as I had been led to believe, that the idea of an abortion was. Obviously people have different experiences with it, but in the movie it's a little bit perfunctory. It's like, well, this is what should happen. Obviously, like, there's again mixed emotions and it's not treated so lightly, but it wasn't this tragic plot point. In a way, it is like the positive thing that she does. It's a hard thing, but it is part of her growing up, part of Jennifer Jason Leigh's character, unfortunately, like learning a hard lesson.
Yeah, learning the lesson, and that's what most teenage experiences are. Unfortunately, teen pregnancy is a thing and it happens, and it's easier for the guy than for the girl. It is our decision. Obviously, if we're a teenager, it's tragic, but I think the way that they just portrayed it as a thing that happens. She really didn't stress out about it too much, to be honest. And it wasn't a big dramatic event where she was crying over the decision. It was more matter of fact. And I liked that. And I think for me, again, not watching it as a retrospective, but watching it as a prospective in the sense that I didn't know when I was watching it that I was going to need an abortion in a few years, but I did. Yeah, I don't even really remember, but I just knew that I think Planned Parenthood had also been planted. That was the people to go to. Somehow
Right.
it was planted in my head. I don't think Planned Parenthood came up necessarily in the film, but those two things together helped me understand what I needed to do when I found myself in that situation. I didn't tell anybody. I
Yeah.
just knew that I needed to go to Planned Parenthood. So I think that's really compelling. I feel like nowadays folks will have more awareness or more knowledge about different options, because back then it
Yeah.
was surgical abortion and that was it. And there weren't any over the counter medications or other options that you can get.
Or even just the internet where you can say, like, what should I do if that resource is so much more available? And I will say, too, that, the interesting thing about this movie is that there is so much teen sexuality in it. Famously, there's like Phoebe Cates in the bikini. Like, it's not a movie that demonizes teen sexual urges. It goes through like the awkwardness of it, the like masturbation, getting caught, it's all different spectrums of it. But then it also has this plot point of one of the possible consequences of having sex is getting pregnant. And sometimes the teen sex comedies that don't have any kind of weight to them, where it's just like everybody's having sex and it's fine and there's nothing to think about. It's just Porky's, Revenge of the Nerds, whatever. And it's actually like, no, there are consequences. And I would say one big difference between most teen sex comedies and Fast Times is that it's directed by a woman, Amy Heckerling, who is just a wonderful director, also did Clueless and a lot of other things. But it's just always interesting when the idea that there is the male gaze and the female gaze. And it's not always so binary,
Hmm.
but it's always interesting to me when the female characters are treated with a little bit more empathy, grounded a little bit more in reality. And then you look at the credits and you're like, oh, because there were women involved. Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know that I realized that. I guess I just assumed that it was directed by Cameron Crowe. No, but you're right. And that's probably why it was just a plot point and it wasn't a big like struggle. Oh, I have to make this decision. And the fact that she wasn't shamed,
Right. She wasn't punished,
character wasn't
Yeah.
shamed at all, wasn't punished. And that was maybe the first film that kind of portrayed abortion in that light. 1983, that was. I'm looking it up. And then the other one that I think I already had my abortion at this point, but yeah, so Dirty Dancing came out when I was still in high school, 1987. And that one had, again, abortion as a plot point. It was a little bit glossed over though, like you didn't really understand what was happening, or at least I didn't
Right.
until maybe the second time I watched it. The big difference is that it wasn't either of the main characters who had to deal with the abortion, either the guy or the girl. Like it was a kind of side story that showed what Baby's character would do. She made choices in that side story that helped elevate her character and, of course, helped integrate her better with the dancers and kind of bring that story along further. But it really was a kind of a side plot point.
Yeah. It's interesting how the phrasing of like Penny's in trouble. And I feel like, yeah, I can't remember the first time I would have seen Dirty Dancing, but probably when I was in high school. Although I think maybe I saw like a televised version when I was younger.
Oh.
It's always interesting now to think back, like, oh, I saw that movie. And it's like, well, I saw a version of that movie that TBS
Yeah, the THS
edited.
version, exactly.
Right. That has come up in film language before of like, that girl's in trouble. In the
Yeah.
same way that we used to not even be able to say pregnant on television, it was Lucy's expecting. They couldn't even say pregnant on television because that was
Well,
inappropriate.
how did Lucy get pregnant if Lucy and Ricky were sleeping in separate beds? That's the
Hmm.
question. So anyway.
Right, right. It's just all this ridiculous fear around sex. What I always think is interesting about Dirty Dancing is, and I don't know, maybe it's different for people now, or who are less sheltered than I was, seeing the movie and then just being like, "Oh yeah, she's a girl in trouble." Okay, like I didn't really question what was happening or what it really meant. I just understood like it was something that wrong. Jerry Orbach didn't approve. Like, okay, I get it. And then to go back later and be like, "Oh, that's abortion." Like they were talking about
Yeah.
abortion.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that movie in the movie theater, and I remember with my girlfriends and stuff, we were all about the dancing and Patrick Swayze, of course, and it was all about
Mhm.
that. And then afterwards, we went out to dinner or something, and then we were talking about it, and somebody else brought up, "Oh yeah, that was interesting plot point about abortion." I was like, "What?" And I really had to watch the movie again to fully appreciate that it was pre-Roe era, so it was definitely a secret abortion, and that's why it was kind of secret in the film. They needed to do it that way because that's the way it probably would have happened at the time.
For sure, right? Because it's a movie in the late 80s that takes place in what, the early 60s?
Sometime in the 60s, yeah.
Yeah.
The early 60s, yeah, for sure. Those were the two, from the 80s. That was when I came of age. So I know you're quite a bit younger than me. I'm a Gen Xer for those who are listening, and you've admitted that you're a true millennial. So, what are some films that when you came of age that kind of opened your eyes, would you say?
It's interesting. I feel like there weren't too many, like the teen movies of my era didn't, to my recollection, like didn't approach that at all. We had sort of the like she's all that, where high school was just like fun and sexy, but there weren't people necessarily having sex. Or if they were gonna go to a hotel room, it was all very like, oh, but it was a pretty not purity culture per se, but like it was all very safe. And again, this is probably my perspective as a very sheltered person, what I was allowed to watch and what I wasn't allowed to watch. It's a little later in my life, but I remember Juno hitting really hard, which Interestingly, Juno is a movie not about abortion, but is
Right.
about teen pregnancy. And, I remember people in my family were like, this movie is so great because it is so blanketly pro life. And I feel like Diablo Cody, the writer, has come out later and been like, that was not really the message. Like, I mean, again, the whole idea of pro choice is that you get choices and
Yeah.
that all choices should be available to you. And that this idea of carrying a pregnancy and choosing adoption should be something without shame. Carrying a pregnancy and keeping a child is something without shame. Having abortion is something without shame. Like all of this should be available. And so I did like how Juno kind of gave the character options that she did go to an abortion clinic and for her was an option and that she chose to not pursue that option. And I feel like I had never seen anyone consider the option at all. And also that her decisions weren't demonized. Anyone that I knew that got pregnant in high school was immediately like pulled out of school and shipped off somewhere else because it wasn't tolerated, where I was.
Hmm.
So, this idea that you could still go to school as a pregnant person, that you could continue your life as a pregnant person. And I think it also showed the difficulty of that option. When people say, don't get an abortion, just carry and give up for adoption, I think the movie shows that that is a very complicated process, both emotionally and physically. And Jennifer Garner's husband in the movie starts to treat her like she's an adult and she's a child. And the movie shows that that is incorrect. Just because she's doing this thing that is very adult like and that she's really mature for her age, she's still a child dealing with this. So, yeah, I found that to be a really interesting look at unplanned pregnancy choices and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was so heartfelt, and I loved Juno. I mean, I felt she was so brave, yeah, the character, to do that. Maybe because I had taken the other choice when I found myself in that same situation. Yeah, I really admired her, but I didn't regret my choice. I still was happy with my choice. But yeah, to your point, I think it really did show that it's not easy to take that choice. You are shamed. I mean, in a way, it's like the difference between being black in America and being gay in America, right? Like one is you wear it outside on your skin and the other you can hide it. And whether that's shameful or not, you can choose whether or not you disclose that. And that's the same thing about where I found myself with my abortion. I mean, I kept it secret for decades. And it's
Mhm.
only the last couple years that I started talking about it more. But I was able to get away with that. Nobody ever found out. I didn't have to walk around with my belly growing.
And I think that's the difference between when somebody gets pregnant and the person who also was responsible in that pregnancy. One person is visibly pregnant. And when you are younger, when you're unmarried, when you are not supposed to be, and you're visibly pregnant, like everybody can see it, everybody can judge in whatever way they want to. People walk up and want to ask questions. I had a friend who was pregnant and it was a good friend, but I like ran up immediately when I saw them and I put my hands on their belly. And I was like, oh my God, I'm one of those people who shouldn't do that. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry. And she was like, no, it's okay. Because we knew each other very well. But people do that to total strangers. They're like, let me touch your belly. How far along are you? Asking all these very personal questions. And the idea is you can't be rude. You have to entertain it. But if you are visibly pregnant, the whole world feels like they have access to you.
Yeah, and they feel invested in wanting to give you
Mhm.
advice, and yeah, I'm sure it's annoying having never been visibly pregnant.
So, what I think is interesting is kind of this new wave of films about abortion, about reproductive health care that feature teen characters that have all come out, kind of within, a similar time span. And I feel like there were three films that came out kind of, I don't know if it was all directly in response to dwindling reproductive health care or some of these tighter restrictions, especially about travel, but there's like three basically like abortion road trip movies that came out around the same time. Plan B, which came out in 2021, Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always in 2020, and Unpregnant also in 2020. All three of them are about teen girls who get pregnant and who have to travel out of their state to receive health care, whether it's looking for plan B, looking for an abortion, and it's because their state has restricted either the healthcare available to them or parental approval. And
Right.
it's interesting, they all have the same premise, but they're wildly different films.
Yeah, absolutely. I found that really interesting because I did watch them all kind of within the same couple weeks. All three films, if I'm not mistaken, they had a girlfriend. So it was a buddy movie in that sense for the purpose of one of them getting healthcare.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I will say Never Rarely, Sometimes Always is definitely not a comedy, is a very much more a dramatic film, whereas Unpregnant and Plan B really kind of follow a like buddy road trip comedy type of film. And, in terms of effectiveness, I was emotionally affected by all of them. Never Rarely, Sometimes Always, I found to be really difficult to watch because it is a very lovely film and there are long moments of no dialogue, and it's just the two friends traveling, or it's just kind of watching them, or it's showing, not telling their emotions. And that made it really difficult because I just wanted to like reach through the screen and to tell like Sydney Flanagan's character, like, do you need someone to talk to? Like, do you need an adult? I'm an adult who can help you. But,
Yeah.
these kids are put in the position where they don't feel like they have an adult they can turn to. If their parents are wildly anti-choice, then they feel like they can't turn to them. And what they're doing, I think, at this point in time is technically illegal. People are now being arrested for crossing state lines or for seeking health care. We're in a post Dobbs, post Roe world now. And the idea that not only are you doing something that is maybe considered morally wrong by your community, you're now doing something illegal. I don't know. Again, I was a very like by the book teen. So that I would have just, I don't know what I would have done if I had ever been in that position. Because, yeah, again, it's about like, where are the adults that you can trust if you just don't believe that they're going to listen to you? I found that to be really difficult to watch in Never Rarely.
Yeah, Never Rarely was the one. Yeah, you're right. It was more of a drama, not even trying to be a comedy. And it had a scene in there. It's not a spoiler, but it's a pretty dramatic scene where she's basically trying to self-induce an abortion and
Mm.
she pounds on her belly. That was a long scene that was really hard to watch, but I think that is the drama. I mean, that's the thing that's happening, whether it's coat hanger in the back alley or pounding on your own belly to try to induce an abortion. I mean, people are desperate. And if you can't travel or you don't have any other options, you don't know what you're going to do. That one really, really hit me hard. Going back to my own abortion, I did know what to do and I was able to do it. If I was blocked in any way, I would have taken matters into my own hands. I certainly would have
Yeah.
traveled out of state if I had to.
Yeah.
Would have been a
Yeah.
lot more difficult, my parents would have found out and all that. What I really liked about both Unpregnant and Never Rarely Sometimes Always is that one in a comedic aspect and the other in a more of a dramatic aspect, but they both basically gave a picture of what crisis pregnancy centers do and their deceptive tactics in lying to people about how far along they are and trying to basically keep people from getting the abortion that they're seeking out by gaslighting them and lying to them and, basically coming up with all this bullshit. They dramatized that in a funny way and Unpregnant, which was good. Important, I think, for the audience to see that this is happening out there.
The idea of like certain weeks and how, what is an okay amount of weeks for someone to be pregnant, to get an abortion, and early term, late term, blah, blah, blah. I mean, you hear stories about people who don't even know they're pregnant and suddenly deliver a baby. People's periods are all over the place. So if you are going by like, well, you missed a period and then you have to know, like you have to take a pregnancy test right away, and the idea that it's an exact science and that every time someone has sex, they should be on top of it, trying to monitor their own pregnancy, or else, because if they're 6 weeks in one day, then you have a child for life. Like it's ridiculous. But yes, these sort of false pregnancy crisis centers, they're not healthcare. They are
Right.
religiously based. To me, I'm like, oh, you built a set. Like what you did is you guys are like playing a little part and you're lying and you're doing this. But yes,
I think Illinois is one of the few states that has actually put laws in place against the crisis pregnancy center bullshit. So I think it's illegal now in the state of Illinois to do something deceptive. I'm not sure exactly what, but in theory, they can sue them
Yeah.
or bring them in or
And I know at least in Chicago, I don't know exactly like what the specific laws are, but I know in a neighborhood that I work in, there is a center that opened, and people immediately were like, this is not a pro choice center. This is like a church backed center. So, like, here's where we can protest, here's where we can do that. So, when you're in a very blue bubble like Chicago, I think people really respond well. And I will also say too, Chicago is famously where the Janes operated back in the, I think it's late 60s, 70s. The Janes were an underground abortion providing group. So there was a dramatized narrative film that came out a couple years ago, but I would recommend the documentary The Janes, which I found to be a really, really interesting documentary of it. I will say there's also a fabulous play called Jane the Abortion and Underground by Paula Kamen, and it is interviews with the actual Janes, and it takes it into a narrative but also is sort of a documentary play. But the documentary feels like a narrative film because yes, you have talking heads and it clearly is a documentary, but because the story is so dramatic, the idea that these women just kind of got together to create this underground network, it's so fascinating. And once I found out about the history of the Janes, I was so proud to be a Chicagoan, so revitalized because it really felt like anyone can make a difference. And these women were just homemakers, grad students, like they didn't have any medical background and they just knew this was necessary. They hired doctors, but they eventually learned how to do the abortions themselves. I actually got to meet one of the Janes. It just is one of those things where the truth is stranger than fiction. It feels like it's a made up story, but it is something real that happened. And the documentary just again is a beautiful capturing of that time and how brave those women were.
they were so brave. I also loved that documentary. I believe it came out literally like a month before or maybe a month after the actual decisions. I had already watched it on HBO or Max, but I went to a screening here in LA.
Mm.
They actually did a screening, and so I got to meet one of the Janes. She was awesome, and I met the director. I'm such a fan. I didn't know about that story. And what a brave group of women, and the fact that they were literally doing it illegal. Like they did eventually, I think, get caught. They basically waived the charges because Roe v. Wade had passed. But it's interesting
Right.
if Roe v. Wade hadn't passed, they might have really been incarcerated.
I didn't see the narrative version of it. I heard it just wasn't exciting of a film.
Yeah, I agree. I didn't watch that film either because I felt like I already knew the real deal. And it what didn't get
Yeah.
great reviews. But the British version of the Janes is what's her name?
Vera Drake.
Vera Drake. Thank you. I was trying to find her on my list. Yeah, the British version of the Janes is Vera Drake. So who knew about that? It's based on a true story of a woman in England in the 1950s. The film that dramatized it came out in 2004. But who knew that there was this woman. Now, I think the Janes in Chicago like really knew they were doing underground abortions. At least the way they dramatized Vera, it was like she just was doing what she thought was good, but she didn't like fully appreciate the illegality about it. That was sort of the way they portrayed her in the film. Whether or not that's true, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and I think I remember that film getting, I think there were some Oscar nominations, some good critical response to it, but I think even for it to be coming out in 2004, like the middle of the Bush era, as a very sort of pro-conservative time in our country, but it also, I think, didn't quite hit the American consciousness as much as other films.
Yeah, I didn't
So,
know anything about it until thankfully you put it on the list, so I did watch it. When I was going through kind of tallying up the films that I had watched and analyzed for this conversation, I also wrote down the genre from IMDb. And a lot of the ones we've already talked about were either comedy or drama or both in some cases. But Vera Drake, I thought was interesting because it's listed as a drama, but the other term that they put on there is crime.
yeah.
It's listed
Yeah.
as a crime film, and I was like, "What?" And I mean, I guess, sure. And
Right, like, technically, yeah, but it's not about bank robbery. Like, I feel like those that's what a crime film is to me, or like noir. It's like, "Oh, The Maltese Falcon," or Vera Drake, and but,
you're
technically it is
right.
about crime. Yeah.
Criminal. Yes. And the actress who played her, or the way she portrayed her, was so innocent, right?
The idea that abortion is criminalized is so ridiculous. Sex has been around since the beginning of mankind, and abortion has been around since the beginning of mankind. The idea that abortion is this new criminal, immoral element, it's just ridiculous. In the same way of like, transness or queerness, the idea of like, well, all these trans people are popping up now. No, the history of queer people, of gay people, of trans people, as long as there have been people, all of this has existed. It's just when we criminalize it, it goes underground and people die, people get hurt, people get killed. Yeah, again, it's almost like we shouldn't criminalize people based on who they are or their bodies.
Yeah, or like the fact that they found themselves in a particular situation and they're just
Yeah.
totally innocent. They should be able
Yeah.
to make decisions. All right, so a few others on my list that I thought were interesting ways they portrayed abortion. There were a few that were kind of in the political realm. One was Swing Vote, which I guess was patently about abortion, but it was mainly about the Supreme Court trying to weigh the decision. That came out in 1999, so a little before our Supreme Court.
Yeah. Which again, and you just look at like that time being sort of the end of the Clinton era, a sort of peak time of America's economy doing great, Sure, Clinton embroiled in controversy, but I don't know. It's always interesting to me when these things come out and where the country is at that point in time and where leadership is and was.
I don't know that I would have ever really thought about it like that, but I feel like you're right. I mean, we just talked about the teen travel films coming out in the 2020 era-ish. There was not very many films that came out in the 90s, for example, because we were pretty cool. We were all
Yeah.
happy. I mean, maybe secretly behind the scenes they were working to try to chip away at Roe v. Wade.
And I think too, if you think about how long it takes to make a movie, it's like I always think, okay, if a movie's released in this year, you kind of got to go back 3 years, and then that's probably when it started to exist. And so, I feel like in reaction to Trump getting elected, all three of those abortion kind of road trip movies, and then you also just saw a lot of movies addressing social issues. And I feel like, in the wake of Roe getting overturned, I think we'll see maybe an influx of some of those projects because now you feel the immediacy of it.
I absolutely agree.
I wanted to pivot to the maybe unexpected entry is the Alien franchise. Abortion really comes to a head in Prometheus, which is the prequel to all of the Alien movies in 2012, but the alien movies, essentially what the alien is doing is forcibly impregnating its human victims. And there is, in my opinion, rape imagery of alien creature forcibly taking someone and the idea of like a chest burster, a little bit more violent than a baby, but it is something that is planted inside you. It is a forcible reproductive event. And I've seen a lot of discussion back and forth on the internet, which is a horrible place to be sometimes, where, men will be like, why do women think this is about rape? It's not, it's an alien, like, chill out, it's just science fiction. And it's kind of like, well, science fiction has always been a genre that uses metaphors for social issues. So I find that interesting because it's such painful, violent imagery in the first quadrilogy and then Prometheus, there is a very terrifying scene where somebody is implanted and they self induce an abortion. And it is very graphic and it is very upsetting. And I don't know, I'm not saying it's like a one-to-one scenario, but it's just, again, this idea that, like, when you have something inside you that you do not want to carry, when somebody violates your body, and you become a vessel, when you become something that is just like a gestation compartment, you lose your sense of humanity. So I think that's a really interesting like addition to the list because it's not very much not like the others.
Well, definitely, what is definitely not like the others for sure. That scene that you're talking about in Prometheus is pretty intense. It's not even really an abortion, it's more of a C-section. I mean, she literally
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
has
yeah.
herself surgery. Well, of course, this alien is growing like at the speed of light, and the actress is so thin and tiny that it's like, wait, how does this even compute? But of course, it's exaggerated and salacious. It's an alien that's growing inside her. But I think she says the phrase that I'm sure I would have said even back when I was 16, get it out of me,
Yeah,
get it out of me. And she just wants it out. And of course, if it's an alien being, yeah. But even a clump of cells that's are human, that was the way I felt at the
yeah.
time. So I get it. I totally empathized with her for sure. And that was an interesting way to dramatize it. I feel like we hit most of them.
I would want to shout out
Sorry.
both Obvious Child and Saint Francis.
Yeah.
Each movie was about a woman that had an abortion. It was not a difficult decision, it wasn't like a tragic thing. And both of those movies are about those women continuing to seek romantic partners and love. And Obvious Child is sometimes referred to as like a rom com about abortion. And St. Francis is a great Chicago filmed movie. Some great local Chicagoans in there. But what I love about St. Francis is she has the abortion, I think, early on in the film. And then it kind of goes in the short time span of like, while she's, quote, physically recovering from the abortion, but she's still like going on dates and still going to her job. And she's not having regrets about the abortion, but it shows sometimes the physical toll that it took on her body and also just like how it emotionally affected her. Because even, folks that might not regret their abortion, it is something impactful. It is an event that affects you. And I think that's where people can sometimes, especially if you are anti abortion, are kind of like, people are just going to use it like it's birth control. And I'm like, I don't know anybody who had an abortion who thought it was a nothing process. It was something that they thought about. For most people I know that have had one, it wasn't like a sad thing. It wasn't tragic. It wasn't wrestling back and forth, but it was like a big decision. So I think it's interesting in both of these films, we don't see the women struggling with like shame or immorality, but it also has weight and impact on their lives.
I love that. Yeah, I think you're right. I felt like in both cases, in a way, you could argue it normalized abortion as
Yeah.
a regular thing that happens, but it wasn't just like taking a birth control pill or something, it was a decision that they both had to make. So in St. Francis, she has the abortion basically at the beginning, and I guess the idea is that it sets her up as a person who chose to not be a mother at that time in her life, but then she goes on to basically nanny this little girl who is adorable. And, of course, that's a great relationship and, love story between those two. In that sense, you would expect her, like maybe the arc is to have her go back and like totally feel terrible that she had the abortion when she did. But it's just a matter of fact. It's just, it wasn't the right time in her life, but she obviously loves kids, and so
Yeah.
probably later in her life she'll have a kid. I think both of those films, to your point, were able to just incorporate abortion as a plot point, but as just life. It's
Yeah.
just healthcare. Unfortunately, women have that extra burden and men don't, they get off scot-free, but it's just a part of life.
And so something like St. Francis, again, as you said, it's not that she hates kids, but a lesser movie could have framed it as, oh no, she feels a connection to children, which is only a connection to her womb specifically. And it's like, no, I mean, you can have a connection to a child, you can have a connection to loving children. You can find your path leads to teaching or nannying or whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean that the choice you made to have an abortion or to not conceive is incorrect.
A lesser movie would have done that disservice. To the point we talked about earlier with Juno, it really would have been a pro-life film in that sense, that the whole point was her regretting the abortion that she had at the beginning, and that was definitely not the point.
Right.
Wow, Eileen, I think we pretty much solved all the problems of the world today. This was wonderful. What a fun conversation. Fun conversation about abortion. That's rare, but hey, we did it. Thank you for sharing all these great nuggets of wisdom and your own perspective and your own experience with us today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Maybe we'll come back for part two. So stay tuned and stay hysterical, everybody.
We are the universe, so beautiful. beautiful. Through all of the hurt, we'll stand invincible. So beautiful. We'll take on the world. 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 We'll take on the world.